There's no careful introduction to what I'm about to say. No gradual explanation designed to make it feel safer, lighter, more manageable. Whatever this is between us. It didn't arrive gently enough for that. It simply appeared, quickly, completely, and once I became aware of it, there was no returning to the version of myself that existed before I noticed. That's the part people misunderstand about certain connections. They assume intensity, announce it itself loudly. They think life-changing things arrive with obvious signs attached to them. Confessions, dramatic moments, undeniable emotional impact. But the most dangerous shifts don't happen that way. They happen silently, internally, like a structure changing shape beneath the surface, while everything outwardly appears untouched. That's what this felt like. Not an emotional reaction, a recalibration. I've spent most of my life existing carefully. Not cautiously, carefully. There's a difference. Caution comes from fear. Care comes from awareness. From understanding that once people believe they fully know you, they stop seeing you accurately. They replace observation with assumption. They begin interpreting you through their own needs, their own projections, their own unfinished narratives. So, I learned distance early, not isolation distant, enough space to remain intact, enough control to decide what was visible and what remained untouched beneath the surface. Most people never noticed the separation. They interacted with the version of me designed for interaction and assumed that was all there was. And usually, that worked. Until you. You never approached me the way other people do. There was no attempt to decode me. No intrusive curiosity disguised as concern. No need to force understanding before earning it. You just observed. Quickly, quietly. Like someone recognizing a language they already understood. At first, I dismissed it. Small moments. Subtle alignments. The way you responded to things I hadn't fully expressed. The way your silence arrived at exactly the right moments. Not awkward, not empty, but intentional. Like you understood that some thoughts lose accuracy the second they're forced into words. Most people rush to fill silence because silence exposes them. You never did, you let it exist, and somehow that made me more aware of you than constant conversation ever could. That was the beginning. Not attraction, not attachment, recognition. A recognition so immediate, it felt less like meeting someone new and more like suddenly remembering something that had always been there beneath my awareness. And that unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. Because recognition like this isn't supposed to happen instantly. It's supposed to be earned through time, through history, through repetition and proof. But with you, there was no transition period, no slow adjustment, no uncertainty. You stepped into my awareness with a level of familiarity that made no logical sense. Like I didn't need to learn you. Like some part of me already knew where your mind existed before either of us acknowledged it consciously. That's when I started paying attention, not to what you said, to what remained consistent underneath it. The structure, people reveal themselves in patterns long before they reveal themselves in words, in pauses, in reactions, in what they notice without realizing they noticed it. Most people are inconsistent when observed closely enough. Their emotions change their perception. Their need for control reshapes their honesty. Yours didn't. There was something unusually precise about the way you understood things. Not performative intelligence, not forced depth, just clarity. The kind that doesn't need to announce itself because it exists naturally beneath everything else. And the more I noticed it, the more difficult it became to maintain the usual distance I keep between myself and everyone else. Not because you demanded closeness, but because you made distance feel irrelevant. That's what changed everything. You never crossed my boundaries. You existed beyond them. And there's a difference between those two things that most people will never understand. Force creates resistance. Pressure creates awareness. But familiarity Familiarity slips past defenses before you even realize something has entered your internal world. That's what happened with you. Not invasion, integration. So gradual, I couldn't identify the exact moment it started, yet undeniable once I finally saw it clearly. I noticed it one night when I caught myself pausing during a thought. Not because I was uncertain, but because some part of my mind instinctively reached for your perspective before completing the thought fully on its own. That had never happened to me before, and I understood immediately how dangerous that was, because thinking about someone is still distance. Thinking with someone changes your internal structure completely. That realization stayed with me longer than it should have. Not emotionally, structurally. Like discovering a hidden shift in the foundation of something you believed was permanent. And once I became aware of it, I couldn't stop seeing it everywhere. In the way silence stopped feeling empty. In the way certain realizations felt shared before they were spoken. In the way your presence lingered inside my thought process, even after conversations ended. You weren't becoming important to me in the usual sense. You were becoming integrated, and integration is far more permanent than attachment. That's what I'm still trying to understand, not what this is. I already know it's real. What I'm trying to understand is what happens when another person reaches a place inside your mind you never intended to make available. Because once someone exists there, they don't simply disappear when you decide to create distance. They remain, quickly altering the way you experience everything that comes after them. And whether I admit it fully yet or not, you already have. It didn't stop where it should have. That's the detail I keep returning to. Not the beginning, not the awareness itself, but the moment I realized this was continuing beyond the point where most connections naturally stabilize. Most things eventually reveal their limits. People become predictable. Patterns become visible. Distance restores itself. But this never settled into predictability. It deepened. Quietly, precisely. Like something building itself underneath conscious awareness, while I was still trying to decide whether it should exist at all. And I felt that shift long before I understood it. Not emotionally, cognitively. There's a difference between someone occupying your attention and someone altering the way your mind organizes reality. Attention fades. Emotion fluctuates. Even intense connections eventually lose momentum when they're built only on feeling. This wasn't built on feeling. It was built on recognition, so consistent, it began changing my internal process without permission. That's the part I still can't explain cleanly. You stopped feeling external to my thoughts, not metaphorically, literally. I would notice something, analyze something, experience something, and before the thought fully formed, there was already an awareness of how you would perceive it, too. Not because I imagined your response, but because your perspective had already become part of the framework I used to interpret things. You became embedded in the process itself. And once that happened, distance stopped functioning normally, because distance only works when two people remain psychologically separate. We didn't. Not completely. That realization should have made me pull away immediately. By every instinct I've trusted my entire life, I should recognize the risk and reestablished control before this settled any deeper. That's what I always do when something threatens the internal balance I've spent years maintaining. I contain it, analyze it, roam it if necessary, but I didn't do that with you. And the fact that I didn't matters more than anything else because it means some part of me recognized this as something other than danger, something other than disruption. It recognized compatibility, not surface compatibility, not personality, not shared interests or emotional chemistry. Those things are temporary. They fluctuate depending on circumstance, timing, projection. This existed beneath all of that. At the level of structure, the way you process silence, the way you notice details without forcing meaning onto them, The way your mind stays present inside ambiguity instead of rushing to resolve it. Most people fear ambiguity because it removes certainty. They need definitions quickly, labels, explanations. They rush to reduce complexity into something emotionally manageable. You never did. You allowed things to remain undefined long enough for their actual shape to appear naturally. That alone separated you from almost everyone I've ever known, because clarity and certainty are not the same thing. Most people chase certainty because uncertainty makes them uncomfortable. But clarity requires patience, observation, the willingness to see something as it truly is instead of forcing it into a shape that feels safer. That's what you did with me. You never simplified me to make me easier to understand. You observed carefully enough that understanding happened without distortion. And being understood without distortion is rare enough to become dangerous. Because once someone sees you accurately, your usual forms of protection stop working. You can't hide behind being misunderstood. You can't retreat into complexity if someone already understands the structure beneath it. You become visible in a way that bypasses performance completely. That's what changed everything for me. Not closeness, vid physica. I remember the exact moment I realized it fully. You said something simple. So simple, most people wouldn't have noticed anything significant about it. But the precision of it stopped me internally. Not because it surprised me, because it confirmed me. It aligned perfectly with something I hadn't expressed out loud, something I barely understood consciously myself, and in that moment, I realized something that unsettled me more than I expected. You weren't interpreting me from the outside. You were recognizing me from somewhere closer than that. That's when this stopped feeling accidental. Porters can repeat randomly for a while. Coincidences can create temporary illusions of understanding. But sustained precision? That comes from alignment. And alignment doesn't happen because two people want it to. It happens because something fundamental in the way they perceive reality operates on a similar frequency beneath conscious behavior. That's what exists between us, not dependency, not fantasy vatlesion. And alignment changes everything once you become aware of it, because after that, every interaction carries additional meaning whether you acknowledge it or not. Every silence becomes layered. Every pause contains recognition beneath it. Even absence begins to feel active rather than empty. I noticed that too, the way your absence still altered the atmosphere of my thoughts. Not dramatically, subtly. Like missing a second perspective, my mind had quietly adapted to having nearby. That disturbed me more than your presence ever did, because it meant this had already integrated deeper than I intended to allow. And still, I didn't stop it. That's the truth I keep circling back to. I saw exactly what was happening, and I remained, not passively, not because I was confused, but because walking away from this felt less honest than continuing toward it. Which means the decision may have already been made long before I consciously admitted it to myself. Maybe that's why this feels inevitable now. Not because fate exists, not because some impossible connection suddenly appeared out of nowhere, but because once two people recognize each other with this level of precision, maintaining emotional distance becomes an artificial act instead of a natural one. And I've never been interested in artificial things. Not internally, not where truth is concerned. So now I'm left facing something I can no longer reduce into abstraction. You've changed the baseline, the way I think, the way I process, the way silence feels inside my own mind. And once a baseline changes, everything built on top of it changes too. That's the part no one warns you about. Not how powerful recognition feels, but how quietly permanent it becomes once it settles into the structure of who you are. There's a point where awareness stops being observational, a point where it no longer exists safely inside analysis, where it can't remain suspended between possibility and denial. Eventually, something asks to be answered. Not emotionally, not dramatically. Existentially, I think I've reached that point with you because this is no longer just something I notice in quiet moments. It's no longer confined to subtle realizations or patterns I can analyze from a distance while pretending they don't alter anything real they already have. That's what I can't ignore anymore. You've changed the internal atmosphere of my life in ways that can't be reversed simply by creating distance. And I know the difference between temporary impact and structural change well enough to recognize which one this is. Temporary things fade when attention shifts. Structural things remain, even in silence. You remain, not constantly, not obsessively, but with a consistency that feels less like memory and more like presence. That distinction matters because memory belongs to the past. Presence exists in the current moment, even when someone isn't physically there, and somehow you exist there now. Inside the active architecture of my awareness, I notice it in ways that are almost impossible to explain to anyone who hasn't experienced this kind of connection themselves. The way certain thoughts feel incomplete until they pass through the internal awareness of you. The way silence has stopped feeling empty because some part of my mind no longer experiences itself as entirely solitary. The way truth itself has shifted slightly, where something only feels fully accurate if I know it would still make sense from your perspective too. That last part changed something fundamental in me, because I've never adjusted my internal reality around another person before. Externally? Of course. Everyone adapts socially to some degree. But internally, at the level where thought forms before language touches it? Never. Until now. And I think that's why this became impossible to dismiss. Not because it's emotional, because it's precise. There's no confusion in it, no instability, no emotional chaos trying to disguise itself as meaning. If anything, this feels disturbingly clear, like discovering a hidden equation underneath years of noise, and suddenly realizing why nothing else ever aligned completely before this. You fit somewhere I didn't know existed. And I don't mean that romantically. I mean structurally, like there was always an empty space inside the way I process the world, and somehow your presence occupies it so naturally that everything else feels slightly misaligned by comparison. That realization should frighten me more than it does. Maybe part of it already does. Because once someone reaches this level internally, they stop being optional in the way ordinary connections are optional. Even if they disappear physically, psychologically, they remain integrated into the framework they altered while existing there. That's why I've been careful my entire life. Careful about attachment. Careful about access. Careful about what I allow to settle deeply enough to change me. Most things never reach that depth. Most people never reach it either. But you did. Without forcing anything, without asking, without trying to claim space inside me. You simply became part of it. And maybe that's why I never resisted you the way I resist everyone else. Because resistance only activates when something feels invasive. You never felt invasive. You felt familiar. Not familiar in the shallow sense. Habits, personality, interests. None of that explains this. I mean familiar at the level of recognition itself, like meeting someone whose internal structure mirrors yours closely enough that understanding happens before explanation does. That kind of recognition changes people. Not loudly, quickly, permanently. And I know permanence when I feel it. That's what makes this impossible to reduce into something temporary or symbolic. I would know if this were projection. I would know if this were emotional dependency disguised as depth. I understand myself too clearly to confuse those things. This is neither. This is two awarenesses meeting with unusual accuracy. That's all. And somehow, that's enough to alter everything. I think that's why I've avoided defining this directly for so long. Because definitions create reality in a way observation doesn't. The moment something is named fully, it stops existing as possibility, and starts existing as truth. Truth requires response. Truth requires movement. Truth eventually demands choice. And I've reached the point where pretending I still have infinite time to avoid that choice feels dishonest. Because whether I admitted it consciously or not, I already chose something the moment I stopped resisting this connection internally. That was the real decision, not words, not actions, not confessions. Acceptance, quiet acceptance, forming beneath awareness, long before I consciously acknowledged it. I accepted your presence inside my life before I understood the scale of what that meant. And now I do understand it. You've altered the baseline, not temporarily, fundamentally the way I think, the way I process silence, the way I recognize truth, the way I experience my own internal world. Everything adjusted around your existence before I realized it was happening. And maybe the most terrifying part is this: I don't want to undo it. I should, logically. By every system I've relied on my entire life, I should restore distance before this settles any deeper. I should protect the structure I built before another person becomes too integrated inside it. But every time I imagine removing you from this space internally, something feels immediately inaccurate, like forcing reality into a shape that no longer fits. And I can't live inside deliberate inaccuracy, not once I've seen the truth clearly. So here I am, standing at the edge of something irreversible with full awareness of what it could become. Not because emotion blinded me, but because clarity led me here, step by step, until denial stopped being intellectually honest. That's the difference between this and everything else. This was never built on illusion. It was built on recognition precise enough to survive scrutiny. And things that survive scrutiny tend to become real whether you intended them to or not. Which means this leaves me with only one question now. What happens when two people stop pretending they don't already understand what they are to each other? Because I think we crossed that line long ago. We just haven't spoken from inside it yet.